Video 3 on making the feathers. In this video I'm going to make a few feathers and place them out along the guide curves that we laid out in the previous video. One way to create a feather is to go to the Yeti menu and select Create Feather from the drop-down menu. This will give us a Yeti feather. Now if you can't see it, try switching to the Legacy viewport. In order to shape the feather and make it look more like a specific type of feather, you can go into component mode and tweak the components of the feather. This way I can shape the feather to resemble more the feathers from my reference. In the attribute editor you can tweak different variables about the feather, for instance bob spacing, starting and ending points, strand length, and also tearing. Ideally, I would have unique feathers all over the bird. But since I don't have unlimited time, I'm going to limit it to a few different feathers only. I recommend having as many different feathers as possible to make it as naturalistic and non-CG-like as possible. Wouldn't it be great if I could create two different feathers and then have Yeti blend values in between those feathers to create unique feathers? Well, Yeti doesn't do that, so we'll have to work around it. If you're keen on trying that out though, I know Houdini does the trick. You would have to model two different feathers and groom them, and then let Houdini blend in between those two feathers to create unique ones. This would be a good way to get a very realistic and unique look for your creature. But since there's no built-in method in Yeti to do this, I recommend that you spend extra time and create a few extra different feather types, just to shuffle it up a bit. Now, as I mentioned in the previous video, we need to create guide curve sets for our guides, so that Yeti can find them and associate that with a specific feather. Since I created different kinds of feathers and want them to be assigned to specific parts of the wing, I make selection sets based on that. Here I'm selecting the wingtip flight feather strands on the left side and creating a guide set. This is because I have a feather specifically for this part of the wing. I modeled two out of flight feathers. One is for the left side and the other is for the right side. This is why I split it up. I try to keep my naming consistent and logical. The more feathers you have and the more guides you have, the more complicated it gets to keep track of where everything goes. So my advice, for your own sake, be much more strict about naming than I am in this tutorial video. So now I'm selecting the right side flight feather guide curves and making a set for that. Now I'm creating a set for the lower layer of the center flight feathers of the wings. Again, giving such a huge part of the wing the same kind of feather is sort of a crime, so sue me. And if you want to do a more realistic bird or creature, you should really create a lot more variation in the wing. But I think this is great, so I'm gonna move on and create more guide curve sets for the upper part of the wing. Now when you created your selection sets with the guide curves, make sure you add it to the Yeti node. You should add it to the input guide sets. And also make sure to add your feathers to the input objects. Once that's in order, let's open the graph editor and start laying out some nodes. The feathers I just created were just a demonstration, so I'm not going to use those, but I'm going to create feathers as I go along. They're easy to make, so just create them as you see fit while you work. First we want to import our base geometry, so use the import node to grab it. And again, for your own sake, make sure to rename everything so that you know what it is. Second thing I want to import is my guide set, so I'll start importing the left outer flight feather wing guide set. Now I'll hook both nodes up to a convert node. The convert node converts strands into fibers. This means that your guide curves will be turned into groom hair strands and you'll no longer need a scatter node. Next I'll grab an instance node and I'll grab an import node to import one of my feathers. If I activate the instance node right away, I'll get a pretty unpleasant result. I actually advise against doing this right away because it might slow your computer down significantly. In the instance node, before you activate it, you want to change the instance to from points to elements. Also under the Objects tab, make sure to check off the Deform box. This will make your feather deform according to the guide curve. Back under the Main tab of the instance node, there's a Scale attribute as well. Since we carefully laid out our guide curves with a specific length, we'd like our feathers to attain that value. What we have here is the x, y and z coordinates. I'm going to multiply the y coordinates of the feather with the length attribute, so 1 times $length. And I'll type in a number that pleases me in the other two variables. So now that's one part of the wing set up. The good thing about this workflow is you can always go in and add another feather if you think there's too little variation. I'm going to go ahead and create another feather, almost identical to the first one, but flipped since it's going to be on the right side of the wing this time. After adding the new feather to my input objects of the Yeti node, I'll go and import it into my graph. I'm also going to create another import node which I'm going to use to import the guide curves from the right side of the wing. Again, same procedure. I'll create a convert node, and I'll connect both the geometry and the guide curves to this node. Note that the only thing you don't have to import several times is the geometry, so that's the only node you can reuse several times. If you use an imported feather on two different guide sets, it will only appear on one of the sets. You'll have to import the same feather again with a new import node to make it appear on both guide sets. When I activate the instance node, I don't get any feathers, and that's because I forgot to set the import node to import my guides instead of geometry. By default it's set to geometry, so make sure you import the right thing. Once it's brought in order, I can see my feathers are back as they should be. I just have to copy my scale attributes from the previous instance node so that I don't have to write the same thing again. You can use the merge node to merge your two Yeti trees. This way you'll see your entire wing with all the different feathers at once. Next thing I'm gonna do is create a middle type flight feather that's going to go in between the two outer wing feathers. Once I'm happy with the result, I'll rename it and add it to the input objects list. The procedure of applying the feather to the wing is the same as before. I'll import the middle section guides, and I'll also import the new feather. I'll then connect the guide sets to the first input of the new convert node. Then I'll connect the geometry to the second input of the convert node. Note that this order is quite important as you won't see any feathers if you do it in the reversed order. Again, connecting the newly imported feather to the instance node, changing the instance to from elements to points, and checking off the deform box under the objects tab. I'll also make sure to copy the scale attributes from the previous instance node to my new one. When I visualize the middle feather, I can see that there are too many gaps, so I'll broaden the feather a bit by changing the X value of the scale attribute. To see all my feathers combined, I'm gonna use a merge node again to merge my previous tree with the new one. So using the merge node, you can combine your different feather instances into one complete wing. As for the feather settings, Tweaking the barb spacing to a number higher than 1 will give you a more crude result. It'll render faster, but if you want a more fine result, you should turn the dial down to 1 or below 1. Changing the barb tip width does exactly what it says. Changing the value to a higher number will give you a broader tip. It's easy to test and see what the different settings does. And it's a good idea to render it once in a while to see what your wing looks like. Using the same procedure as before, I'm going to add more guide curves and feathers to my wing. That concludes the first grooming video. In the next video, I'm not going to be talking as much as I'm just going to be grooming the wing. So until then, have fun grooming. That's what it's all about.